So my name is Jim Kalbach. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm the head of customer success at Mural, which is a virtual workspace for digital collaboration for designers. So we're actually targeting kind of the work that you do, but in a digital sense. And we have a display out there, as Simon said, and I suggest you come over and take a look at it. In 2007, I wrote the book called Designing Web Navigation, and I'm just publishing my second book with O'Reilly right now, called Mapping Experiences, and that's going to be out in December. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, very broadly, about mapping experiences in all its forms, and kind of the role that it plays, I think, in our discipline. And I want to make 3 points throughout my talk, so I'll be stopping and making 3 points, and then summarize that at the end. So I'm going to start with my mandatory Apple reference, so that I get that out of the way right away. But in 1997, Steve Jobs said, "You've got to start with the customer experience and work back toward the technology, not the other way around." Right? And we thought this was, at the time, we thought it was brilliant. And he kind of gave away his strategy for turning Apple around. In other words, to turn Apple around, he actually turned the equation for software design around, right? Think about the experience first and then develop the software from there, the solution from there. And we thought this was revolutionary. And at the time, to some degree, it was. And of course, I think most of us here in the room would warm up to the idea, because this is kind of our cause, or what we're trying to do, more or less. But it's not necessarily a new thought. It's not necessarily new. In fact, in 1960, a gentleman named Theodore Levitt, who's a famous business professor, a very well-known business professor, wrote, "An industry begins with customer and his needs, not with a patent, a raw material, or a selling skill. The industry develops backwards, first concerning itself with the physical delivery of customer satisfaction." Almost the exact same sentiment in 1960. And this appeared in a very famous article that he wrote called Marketing Myopia. And I suggest you go out and look at Marketing Myopia. I know there's a PDF of it out there. It's not very long. But when you look at this article and business literature at the time, you get a sense, wow, they were really thinking different back there, right? They were actually teaching customer satisfaction comes first, and we develop our businesses around that. So the question I have is, what happened in the 40 years between the sentiment in the 50s and 60s with business and management up until Steve Jobs? What happened in those 4 decades? And essentially, it was greed, in a word. That the Chicago School of Economics, for instance, Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, came up with another theory about business. Basically, they said the role of a company, of a corporation, is to be profitable. Profitable first. If the corporation is profitable, employees will benefit, and society will benefit from that, right? And this gave license to business managers and MBA schools to kind of teach that philosophy and to make decisions based on profit, right? That was the imperative of any business. And it actually doesn't work. There's now empirical evidence that shows that we're working more for less at the same time while corporations are actually gaining more money. So this theory kind of at a societal level actually does not work. And I think as a result of this, too, our trust in corporations is at an all-time low. And we blame them for society's ills. Environmental problems, unemployment, and so forth, right? And because this was the leading kind of imperative for running a business, this is what was taught in management schools, and companies are now trapped in this model of trying to create value, or rather trying to extract value, because they were thinking more about how do we get value from a market rather than how do we create value, like Theodore Levitt suggested. But I think there's hope. And there's a movement out there right now called shared value. It started a little bit before 2011, but most people in the shared value movement actually point to this article, and the title of it was Creating Shared Value by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer. Came out in 2011, and this kind of cemented the idea of shared value. And these are business people, right? So these aren't designers saying we need this. This is businesses saying, kind of capitalism is under siege. right? And this mistrust in corporations, we, from the business side, we need to do something about it. And basically what they're saying is you need to create profit and have social benefit at the same time, that the profit imperative is not good enough in and of itself. They're talking about it actually from a competitive side, right? So they say to be competitive, you need to think about how you're going to be profitable and create social value as part of your business model. Let me give you an example. For instance, there's a program called Skype in the Classroom. And Skype in the Classroom lets teachers find other instructors around the world and kind of build innovative curricula for their students. So it actually enriches the students. So with every interaction with Skype in the Classroom, there's a benefit to Skype, but there's also then a social benefit, right? Another example, the International Hotels Group has a Green Engage program where they were putting environmental measures into how they ran their hotels. They ended up saving 25% of their operating costs, but then offered, environmental friendly hotels, which is a competitive differentiator for them as well, too. So it's not about corporate social responsibility, right? That's philanthropy. That's giving money to a charity or something like this. What shared value is saying is that the way that businesses need to think and manage themselves now is to think about profit and social benefit at the same time. And I think this is interesting. This is interesting for us. But it represents a fundamental shift in business thinking, right? And I don't want to suggest that, times are more turbulent now than they were decades ago, because there's always change, it's just a different type of change. But I think the type of change that we're seeing here with notions like creating shared value, again, coming from the business community, I think this type of change is proportional to Copernicus discovering that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Right? Through observations with very low fidelity instruments, he was able to actually create this model. I think this was the model that Vanessa was referring to in the very top of her timeline. It's an infographic, right? It's a visual representation of the solar system that he created 1543. And it's a scientific discovery, but the impact on society was actually pretty profound because it raised some existential questions. For a society, planet Earth, that thought they were the center of the universe, suddenly they're not the center of the universe, right? And suddenly, we're now just the third rock from the sun. So this was a pretty profound discovery, and I believe the shared value and the sentiment of reversing our thinking. Let's start with the customer experience and work our business out from there. I think that's on the same proportions as this discovery. So my first point is that future survival, or survival in the future, requires a reversal in business thinking, right? You got to start with the experience and figure out how you're going to create value from there, and not the other way around. So I think I just tweeted that, I think, if you're following me on Twitter. So that's my first point, and this is the point in the presentation where you might say, big fucking deal Kalbach. What does that have to do with us? Okay, which is fine, and let me explain what I think this has to do with us. I want to go back to shared value and look at how Michael Porter says that companies should approach creating shared value. And this is what he said in a video interview. He's advising companies, how do I conceive of shared value when my imperative has always been just maximize profit? What do I need to do? He says, well, you need to figure out what your product is and what your value chain is. Understand where those things touch important social needs and problems. Sounds good. If you're in financial services, let's think about saving or buying a home, but in a way that actually works for the consumer. Right? Buying a home in a way that actually works for the consumer. And when I heard that, two things came to mind. One was I thought, wow, that's what I do. That's what we do, right? That's the thing that we say our business stakeholders don't get, right? Because we're trying to do it in a way that actually works for the consumer, right? So I thought, wow, this has got to be relevant to UX people, to designers, this whole notion of shared value. The second thing I thought when I heard that sentence was the word actually. And it's kind of a subtle admission that business folks didn't necessarily think about that before. And I thought, well, if actually, in a way that actually works for the consumer, how were you doing it before? Were you doing it in a way that maybe not worked for the consumer but was cheap to make and easy to sell? I don't know. So let's think about how it actually works for the consumer. So when you think about buying a home, right, buying a home is a pretty big, complex set of interactions and human motivations and emotions and things. How do we conceive of buying a home in a way that actually works for the consumer? Well, we can try to visualize it. And this is a diagram created by Sophia Hussein, who's going to speak to us tomorrow, one of our illustrious speakers, around buying a home. And what she did was she mapped out all of the behaviors and all of the interactions involved in buying a home, right? So you have selecting a neighborhood over here, determining what you can afford, finding the new home, and so forth, and then a series of related activities around those, plus some touch points with some technology, right? So with this, we're actually able to see the value chain, what our product is, in a way that actually works for the consumer. So for designers, and you've probably seen these types of diagrams as well before, what they ultimately do, I think it goes beyond just touch point optimization and incremental improvement. I think what this allows us to do is to talk about value so that we can actually visualize value. If we're talking about value being an exchange between an individual and an organization, we can actually visualize that and have intelligent conversations around value creation and around things like shared value with our business stakeholders. And the equation is fairly simple, right? We have individuals, we have people acting in the world trying to get things done, and they're seeking some benefit from an organization, some product or service, and where those two overlap is an exchange of value, right? So it's, it's the interaction between an individual and an organization and the benefit that each receives from that interaction. This is essentially fundamentally what businesses do, and this is what Theodore Levitt was talking about. So we have these, a series of approaches already in our toolkit that we use, like the diagram that I showed from Sophia. And we also have customer journey maps and experience maps and service blueprints and mental model diagrams and ecosystem maps. We have this class of document, this activity that we're already experts at, that again, I believe kind of go beyond just optimization of an interface or incremental improvements, that what we can show here is value alignment. We can show businesses, we can start having conversations around how do you create value and how do you create shared value. And I call all of these actually alignment diagrams. It's something I talk about in my book. Alignment diagrams is simply a term that categorizes them. It's just an umbrella term. It's not a thing. It's not a method. It's basically just saying that we have this class of documents that actually has a strategic value to businesses because we can show value alignment with these documents. And I'm pretty much assuming that most people have heard or used those types of diagrams. Is that correct? Everybody's nodding? Yeah, okay. Let me give you an example. I'm just going to flash a couple screens up here to show you what I mean by this principle of value alignment. If creating value is showing the interaction between an individual and an organization, that's what these types of diagrams fundamentally do. Here's an example of a customer journey map that I created. What you have here are phases of interaction here, becoming aware of the service, all the way to renewing or upgrading the service. And the top part tries to encapsulate the experience that the person has, right? Actions, thoughts, and feelings. So we describe the individual and what they're trying to get done. The bottom half describes what the organization does and which each department has to do at what touch point. And then in the middle, we show that interaction, right? So at the highest level, a customer journey map qualifies, by my definition, as an alignment diagram because it shows this equation of value creation and value extraction. An experience map, and some of the differences here are only in name only, by the way. In fact, I encourage, like, as Vanessa mentioned, that you have this collection of terms that overlap, and I'm really not concerned about the terminology. What I'm concerned about is the underlying principles that we see in each of these types of diagrams. Here's an experience map created by Chris Risden of Adaptive Path for a service called Rail Europe. If you're traveling through Europe, right, you plan and research your travel, and then you go, and then there's post-travel phase. And at the top, they describe the customer experience, and at the bottom, some opportunities for the organization. So again, you get this pattern of value creation and interaction. Here's a service blueprint. This is for attending a conference, right? So when you attend a conference, you register for the event, you go to the event all the way up to depart. And what this does is it shows what is the individual doing, what is the business, or in this case, the organizers of the event have to do, and where do they meet. Sophia's model was a circle, and I just showed some tables from left to right, kind of chronological, but there are other ways to show this as well, too. This is a mental model diagram. This is a method created by Indy Young. She wrote a book called Mental Models. Some of you may have heard of it. And it's actually more hierarchical than chronological. So what you do, it's a very prescribed method where you do firsthand research and then you build up a model hierarchically. You cluster tasks into towers and then those get grouped into mental spaces. And these documents can be very long. I'm only showing you 2 sections of about 15, so this would be a very, very long document. And in this case, it's going to the cinema. What are all the things that people do, think, and feel? What philosophies do they have around going to the cinema? And it represents that pattern again, too. In the top, we see some description of the person's mental model, and then down below you put all the features and support that an organization provides. What are all the ways that we support that interaction, right? So we have this essentially this basic equation that is already baked in to these documents that we're already experts at. But I believe we can take these and have broader conversations within our organizations, and not just how can I make my project or my product better, but rather we can start helping the business think in that reversed way. What's the experience and how do we figure out the business model from there? Which is kind of my second point, that I think the aspiration of design with a capital D should be more than just delight, right? That we help realign the business perspective by visualizing actual value, right? We show that actual value. I think I just tweeted that out too. I hope I did. But it's not the diagram. It's not the answers are not in the diagram. In fact, you have to be very, very selective what goes into that diagram, and you're actually going to exclude more than you include. Because when you talk about an experience, it's a big fuzzy thing, right? There's emotions, there's all kinds of messy human nature involved in describing an experience. So you have to be judicious about what you're going to include and what you're not going to include, depending on your situation and depending on the audience of these documents, right? So the answer isn't going to come from the document itself, because here's what you're not going to do. If you've ever done a customer journey mapping project or service blueprint project, here's what you don't do. You don't do all the research and create the diagram and then put it as an email attachment and say, hey, what do you guys think about it? That's not the end of that effort. The end of the effort is, hey, let's all gather around this, because they're compelling artifacts, right? And they actually leverage our skills as designers to create a compelling artifact to show that value creation equation. And we take them into workshops, or we hang them in the halls with blue tack. And we work with our teams and our stakeholders to create this shared meaning around what does it mean to create value for customers? How do we do that, right? So I think that a skill that we need to be thinking about as a field, user experience and design, we need to be thinking about facilitation. I think we wear lots of hats, as Vanessa pointed out, and I like to think about it as kind of 2 primary hats that we currently wear, and one is around, I call it the interpreter hat, right? And that's looking at the outside world, doing research and testing, right, and interpreting that meaning back into the organization. And then we also wear the hat of creator, right, and that's all the roles that Vanessa was talking about, the coder, the copywriter, right? We actually create artifacts. We create products, or designs for products at least. But I think we need to be thinking about a new hat that we need to wear around facilitation. That we need to think about how do we start having those conversations around value creation. And we talk a lot about we have to speak the language of business, right? Has anybody heard that before, that designers have to be better at speaking the language of business? Which I don't disagree with, but I actually think it needs to be the other way around too. Because if we're starting with the user experience and working backwards from there, right, then they need to be able to speak the language of design as well too. So this role of facilitation, I think that's a whole other hat that we as an industry, we need to develop more. And probably in this room, most of you qualify as facilitators, right? Because these are some of the best UX people in London. So I'm not saying we're not doing that, but I think as a field, we need to get better at that, and we need to be facilitators, and we need to be grassroots strategic players. Right? We might not have a chair at the table, that proverbial chair at the table, or maybe if we do, it's a folding chair and we brought it ourselves kind of thing. But we can still have these conversations, right? We can have these conversations at a grassroots level, and I believe these visualizations are a key way that we do that. And it leverages our existing skills. We don't have to quit our jobs and and get an MBA to have these strategic conversations, right? Because if understanding humans is understanding business, right, we can show that part of the equation with things already in our toolkits. This is an example from a project that I did at LexisNexis a few years back, where we created a whole series of diagrams that showed the workflow of lawyers. LexisNexis creates solutions for lawyers, and we had done this mapping exercises in various countries. And then we got invited, my colleague Catherine McDonald and I got invited to the senior management meeting, the annual senior management meeting in Montreux, where people flew in from around the world. These are vice presidents and the heads of all their business units. And we were invited there to show off our maps, and then they did some role playing. So they did a mock trial based on that exercise. Senior leaders got up and did a mock trial. It was basically, let's walk in the shoes of lawyers and do what they do. And they actually acted out a mock trial up front to kind of get that perspective of what it is to be a lawyer. And that was based on our mapping experience, right? So we were there, we were invited. Again, it was a folding chair at the table, but we were there. We were invited to senior management meetings because we had done this visualization work, because we were focused on creating value for customers. And it's also about co-creation. So facilitation isn't just talking, right, at people. You don't do this behind closed doors and say, here, I've visualized something for you. I'm going to present it to you. Rather, it becomes an inclusive process. And that's part of that grassroots strategic leadership, is to get people involved in actually creating meaning around visualizations or these diagrams that we create. And we can then look at solutions too. So we can extend our skills and say, okay, if this is what we believe the world is and how we need to behave as a company, what are some solutions? So again, we can leverage our design skills as leaders. So my third point is that mapping experiences leverages our existing design skills to become facilitators and grassroots strategic players. I did. I just tweeted that. Thank you. So here are the 3 points again, and I've summarized it actually in one sentence, right? Help reverse business thinking by visualizing actual value and become strategic leaders. And again, it's not the map, it's the mapping, it's the verb. It's not the noun, it's the verb of mapping that we want to focus on. And that, I think, helps us become strategic players and ultimately business partners. Because this idea that, a designer isn't a business person, I think, well, of course we're part of the business. Because design is part of the business, because humans are in the equation. Therefore, we're strategic leaders. Just one more diagram before I go. This was an ecosystem map created by Andy Polane and Lavron Lovely. This is for car sharing. This is a car sharing diagram. It's an ecosystem model. What they did was they showed various touch points and motivations around the act of car sharing. But what they started was kind of from the small to the large. So in the middle, this is the person's individual experience in the car and what options they have and what touch points they have. And then they showed, well, what's it like when you have a driver and a passenger? So you're still in the car, but you have two people. And then they wanted to see, what's it like with two cars on the road? How do they interact with each other? And then this is cars with other businesses or other services. And then cars in the community, and then cars in society in general, what meaning that has. And they broke this up into different facets of information: who, what, where, when, why, how. So they've created this model of the car-sharing solar system. And when I saw this, I was kind of reminded of Copernicus's model of the solar system, which puts the sun at the center, and here you see the customers at the center, right? So this idea of reversing thinking. And guess what? Your business is not the center of the universe. Your business is the third rock from the sun revolving around the customer. So thank you very much. Can be. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question. Yeah, I have a question. It's
Yeah.
kind of do it right, share value must be both
That's right.
consumer focused and business focused.
That's right. That's absolutely right. That's the word shared is. And I think that the equation and kind of the point of my first slide was that we got into this extremely lopsided model of business that was literally profit only. And that's what was taught, sometimes directly. Your job is to maximize profit. That's what managers are taught, and it's extremely lopsided. And what the business community, again, this is Michael Porter, these are business leaders, what they're saying is we need balance back in that equation. Yes, a business has to be profitable. Of course they do, right? You won't survive otherwise. But it also has to give something back. And it's not just giving back to the consumer as well, too. It's giving back to society, education, environment, employment, things like that as well, too. So the question is, how do we bake that into the fundamental business model so that in each interaction there's shared value? Again, it's not corporate philanthropy where they're going to just give money away. It's every time they interact with a customer, it's actually creating value for both in both directions and value for society as a whole as well too. And that begins with a focus on what actually works for customers. And I think that's a role that we can play. And you know, you might have does anybody have a chief design officer in their organization or a vice president, senior vice president of design? And that's good, and that helps as well too. But I think we need to be at a grassroots level. We need to be having these conversations, and they may not be direct, and it may take time. It may take time. So you know, engaging and facilitating these conversations around this it's not going to be, you're not going to do one map, one session, one diagram, and they're going to get it, right? It's a conversation over time that we have to facilitate and keep that conversation going. And like I said, I think business people have to learn our language as much as we have to learn their language as well, too. And visualization, so I was kind of focused on a specific type of diagram, right? These alignment diagrams, journey maps, things like that. But you know, just in general, I think our visualization skills are something that we can leverage to become grassroots strategic players.
So does that mean then, that's another question, does that mean you feel that designers also have to appreciate and getting a grip, a handle on business value, how business works?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. I do think that business people have to understand design, but I think we need to practice our skills in terms of understanding how a business works. And I think we're getting much better at it. I mean, I've been to a lot of these events, and we talk about the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas and other tools that are out there, other perspectives that are out there to understand business. But for a very long time, business got wrapped up with finance, right? And if you weren't a bean counter or a finance guy, it was kind of this black box of business. But business is much bigger than that. That's what Theodore Levitt was talking about that. Business is about creating value, and it's an exchange, and it's strategy, and it's differentiation. And for some reason, business got wrapped up in these strategy planning meetings. You have these in your organizations where once a year, top leadership sequesters itself for a weekend, and they go and they plan. That's basically just financial planning. Like, how much money are we going to invest in what technology, and when is this going to be delivered? Right? But they're not talking about how do we create value or how do we win? Like, what's our strategy to win in the marketplace, right? A financial plan is not going to let you know how to win. And so I think we are, as a field, I think we are getting more sensitive to business concerns. And that's why I said focus on value-centered design. Right? You have user-centered design, business-centered design, maybe content or technology-centered design. Let's talk about value-centered design, because that harmonizes the two perspectives. Because if I'm talking about value, I'm talking about creating something for customers, but also how does the business gain from that? So let's focus on value.
The question I have for you, I feel like the conversation about, and it's very much present in HBR, like every other issue, is
Yeah.
the design thinking. It's now the language of business.
Yeah.
I guess one of the questions I have for you is, as we move forward and our diagrams are stunning and engaging as artifacts and pieces, is there a conversation or measurement that business understands, or a KPI that you think we can bring to the table? Because yes, we can bring the color and we can bring the pictures, but they want something that they can benchmark, triple bottom line. Have you seen KPIs you like?
So I think we need to get better at that too, measuring, and it's very tough. And the Design Management Institute has their design value index, and they have a whole framework to figure out some value of design. But you know, this is just one way, I believe, that we can become strategic players. It's something that I've had a lot of experience with. It's something that I'm putting in my book. It's something that a lot of other people in this room perhaps have done in terms of visualizing a picture of the story in some way and using that as a compelling conversation piece. But there's also things like lean UX, which I think also, so I'm not suggesting this is all you need. I think what we need are several things like alignment diagrams and visualizing value. But lean UX is a great example of a way that you can actually, I mean, it starts with what's the first question in lean UX are what are the business outcomes we're trying to get to, right? And if you look at Jeff Gotthelf's stuff, who wrote the book Lean UX, he talks about 5 different types of metrics: acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. Right? And for each one of those categories, you could come up with some target that you want to do. We want to increase activation, or we want to increase acquisition. So I think there are frameworks like Lean UX out there that allow us to do that. And now not only do we have the big picture, and we can talk about customer value and empathy with things like this, but now we can go in and say, we said as a group, we're going to try to move these 3 needles. Right? And that's what we're going to focus on. So I think other things like Lean UX also help us become grassroots strategic players as well, too. Does that answer your question?
This gentleman next,
and I said, before you ask the question, too, I actually see these 2 things going together as well, too. Because Lean UX kind of starts with, we know what we're going to do, and then we want to measure that. But this is kind of like bigger picture kind of things. Like, here's everything, where and how do we want to create value? So this might be a conversation you have before you have Lean UX or specific measurement questions.
So my question would be, because folding chairs are great, because it's much harder to get asleep on a folding chair than in a comfortable armchair or something like this. So at some point you get so involved with the big business, you only meet like other business people and stuff. So how do you keep yourself on the grass level while you're on the top of the organization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a type of design leader, and Simon and I were talking about this yesterday over lunch, that I think there's a type of design leader that's often missing. Someone who is able to work with a perspective of hands-on design and know what's going on down at the floor, but then be able to put perspective on that externally. UX strategist, there's different terms for that as well, too. On the other side of the coin, I think as well, too, that as business leaders become more sensitive to this, I'm hoping, and I'm starting to see this to some degree as well, too, that it's not such an uphill battle, that it's actually then expected of designers, and the product manager or even the business analyst also has those concerns, right? So ultimately, if that's the case, then ultimately you can ask the question, and I've asked the question, will UX just disappear, right? Because think about an organization that gets it, the proverbial it that we keep talking about that they don't get. What happens when the organization gets it? Then do you need UX anymore, or do you just need really great designers like Vanessa was talking about doing the stuff? And I actually think to some degree, and I might be a little polemic here, but I think the goal of our field should be to make ourselves obsolete. What's that? Yeah, right. That's not a great career goal. But we win. I think we win, and that's the thing too. It takes time, like I said, and the measurement for me, the kind of the qualitative measurement of my success doing this type of work, mapping type of work, is when I hear a business stakeholder repeating something that I know came from me because the terminology or that workshop that we're in, and sometimes it's months later. Right, so it doesn't happen overnight. But then I start hearing the business talking to me in my own terms. That's when it's good. You know what I mean?
Hi. How do you relate? I'm reminded of the values-centered design that comes out of UW, University of Washington State, Batya Friedman, which is about human values rather than customer value. And I'm thinking that there's probably a strong connection, and I was wondering if you know of her work and how you would see them as being connected.
I don't. And I made a slip up when just at the end there, I said values, and then I changed it to value because I realized that values-centered design is something else, just the term, but I didn't realize that it was a thing already.
Yeah.
So now I have my homework. You guys have your homework. You got to read Shared Value and Marketing Myopia.
I think there's something
my homework. It sounds fascinating.
Learned, yes,
Yeah.
from a collaboration
Yeah.
between the two. So.
Right. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Great, thanks.
No, the value, this goes back to Simon's point, the value-centered design is also business value as well, too. But when you look at the customer side of it, there are human values that are involved, and that's what they value, right? Is that, you know, ultimately they're looking for meaning, right? They are looking to get a task done, but they want to feel a certain way, or they want to create meaning in their lives, right? So the values definitely will play a role in that, and I'll take a look at that. Thank you so much.